Today we're beginning a 6-part overview of the New Testament. Now remember, the New Testament is the smaller part of the Bible. The Old Testament has 39 books, many of which are quite long, and the New Testament has only 27. But it can still be pretty confusing. I mean, who wrote it? Why is it so different from the Old Testament? As we did with the Old Testament, we're going to divide the New Testament into 6 chunks or sections to try to show you how they all fit together and to give you a sample teaching and modern application from each section. Before we begin this first section, let me just say a word about the New Testament as a whole. Whereas the Old Testament was written in ancient Hebrew, the New Testament was written in Greek, which was the most common language in the Roman Empire at the time that it was written. The Old Testament covers a huge section of history, thousands of years. The New Testament begins with the birth of Jesus, and by the end of that first century, it had all been written. But just the fact that it was written 2,000 years ago is going to make it hard to understand, and it will often leave us with the so what questions. So what bearing should it have on our lives in 21st century America? Well, if I haven't scared you off so far, let's get to it and take a look at this first section, the part that we call the Gospels. The first 4 books of the New Testament are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each of these books is a short biography of the life of Jesus. 2 of these biographers were part of Jesus' original 12 disciples, Matthew and John. Matthew had been a tax collector, a dishonest one in fact, whose life had changed when he met Jesus. And John was one of the group of disciples who had a fishing business on the Sea of Galilee. The third writer was a medical doctor who knew the disciples and traveled with the Apostle Paul. And the other author, Mark, was a young man who had become a follower of Jesus after witnessing much of Jesus' ministry. Each of these 4 books tells us about Jesus' life in a way that is unique to that particular writer, and each contains events and teachings not found in the other 3. Although Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the most similar. 2 of these biographies begin with the events surrounding Jesus' birth in the village of Bethlehem, not far from the Jewish capital of Jerusalem. Jesus' earthly parents, Mary and Joseph, were devout Jews who could trace their genealogies way back to some of the people like the patriarchs that we had talked about in our Old Testament overview. But after Jesus' birth and one event when he was 12 years old and his parents took him from their hometown of Nazareth to Jerusalem, well, the story skips to the time Jesus is about 30 years old and begins what is usually called his public ministry. Most people think this probably indicates that Jesus' childhood and growing up years were pretty normal, the oldest son of a carpenter's family. In fact, Luke summarizes those years this way. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. But these things changed when Jesus became a man. He leaves home and he begins a 3-year career as a traveling teacher or rabbi, the Hebrew word for teacher. And that's the point at which all 4 of the Gospels really begin to give us a pretty detailed story of those 3 years. Now, you may have noticed that I just referred to these 4 biographies as the 4 Gospels. Gospel is just a Greek word that means good news. The story of God's loving us so much that he sent his eternal Son to save humanity from their sin and its consequences. Well, I guess people just thought that this was such good news that they called these 4 books Gospels. Now, let me stress 3 things about the Gospels. First, they are historically accurate. They are each written by someone who was an eyewitness to these events, or else used eyewitnesses as the source for what they wrote. And though they are very upfront about why they wrote these biographies, well, John says it was so that we might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name, they didn't make up stories. Now, remember, there were thousands of people in Israel who were also eyewitnesses to Jesus' ministry. And the Gospels would not have survived if they had been fiction. Actually, there are other Gospels about Jesus that do that very thing. They make up strange stories about Jesus. But when you read them, well, the difference is obvious right away. Secondly, not only are the biographies historically accurate, but that they accurately and reliably, continue to be affirmed by historians and archaeologists. It's so exciting to read about the latest archaeological discoveries that explain some incident in the Gospels that we didn't understand very well and the critics had claimed was false. And thirdly, though it was written 2,000 years ago, those people were not ignorant or uneducated. They understood that virgin births just do not happen. They didn't talk about demon possession because of their primitive misunderstanding of mental illness. That's why when they saw the miraculous things that Jesus did, they said that this had to come from God. There was just no other logical explanation. So this week, we're going to look at a story from Jesus' life and the miraculous things that he did. And then next week, we'll conclude our look at the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by talking about Jesus' teachings. By the way, if you would like to read one of these four biographies during these next few weeks, you might start with the second one, Mark. It's the shortest, only 16 chapters, and maybe the easiest to understand.